Okay guys, we are going to talk fur prices in this video. I know it's been a while since I've done so. That's because there hasn't really been a lot to report on until recently. So we're finally starting to see fur being moved, fur sales taking place, and there is some data and information to suggest that we can have a better idea of what's going on in the market. So I'm going to do like a broad overview of the fur market and where we're at right now, and kind of look at the overall things that are driving the market, and then zoom down into some actual prices. Actually, I'll try to get to prices fairly quickly for those of you who are looking for specific fur price information. But I did do a really deep dive recently, and one of the reasons I'm doing this video is because I know a lot of you, unfortunately, that follow this channel don't listen to the Trapping Today podcast. So I go over a lot of this in the podcast, but for those of you who are not listening into that, this is kind of a more brief version of what I'm going to cover in the podcast. As I'm recording this, I've already done one part of this, and part two is like an hour-long discussion about macroeconomic factors that are influencing the fur market and what I think is going to happen in the years to come. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, I'd encourage you to check that out. But otherwise, let's get into fur prices. So we know that the fur market overall is dominated by consumers in other countries outside of North America. So we do have some consumption in the US and Canada of fur, but really fur isn't that fashionable here. The climate in most of the US doesn't require fur as a utility item. So we ship and export a lot of fur to places like China and Russia, where it's consumed, as well as Italy and Greece. There's some fashion consumption for fur there as well, and a few other countries. But though China and Russia make up the bulk of the market. Now with COVID, everything kind of changed. You know, world economies just kind of collapsed, and all things shut down for about a year. So there essentially has been a big pause in the movement of any type of fur items, but we're starting to see a change there. And so just a quick overview of the factors that are influencing fur prices is basically, do the countries that consume fur have the money to spend on it? Do they have the money? And another factor that I think plays a little bit less of a role, but it is important, is the weather and how cold it is in those countries, and whether they need to buy a bunch of fur items. That is the demand side of things, and that is influenced by basically the economies in countries that consume fur, primarily, like I said, China and Russia. And right now, the Chinese economy, although it is coming back out of the COVID sort of recessionary period, it is continuing growth in China. Economic GDP growth has continued to slow for the past basically 20 years. And so they're still growing, but they're growing at a slower and slower pace every year, which really makes sense because you can't grow at 10% annual rates over time for long periods of time. It just is not sustainable. So recently, the economy there has been growing at about 6% a year, dropped to a shrinking during COVID, and now it's back up to somewhere around 3% for the most recent numbers. And it'll probably make its way back up to around 5 or 6%. So there is a growing consumer base in China, but it's growing at a much slower rate. And those people right now, most of them like fur, but that may be changing, and maybe less likely to consume fur. Russia has always been a fur consuming country, the very cold climate, and fur is part of the culture there. They understand the utility and the quality of fur, and real fur, and how warm it is, and all of that. So Russians don't mind spending money on fur. The problem is they need the money. And the Russian economy is driven usually by oil prices, because they're a major exporter of oil, and good part of their economy is dependent on oil. And so if we look at the oil price charts recently, back the last time we had really good fur prices, oil was over $100 a barrel. Oil dropped down to around $20 to $30 a barrel throughout COVID, and it's finally coming back up, and it's around $65, $66 a barrel as I record this. So it's back, it's coming back, it's in good shape, but it's nowhere near what it needs to be for Russia to actually be a major consumer of fur. Add to that the conversion rate of the Russian ruble to the US dollar. The last time we had really good fur prices in the 2012, 2013 era, 2014, the Russian ruble, the dollar was worth about 30 to 35 Russian rubles. So 35 to 30 Russian rubles would purchase $1 US equivalent. Today that number's up to 77. So the Russian ruble related to the dollar is less than half as valuable as it was just less than a decade ago. So that's a big deal. So these two countries, and Russia's economic growth is nothing to get excited about either. It's very slow, it's steady, but very slow. And so I was spent a few hours the last couple of days looking at all these numbers and these charts and really starting to develop a better understanding of the demand side of the fur market globally. And I'm realizing that unless some new demand pops up somewhere that is unexpected, the overall demand for fur is not going. I don't believe it's going to grow at a rate that we expect it to. The other emerging countries that are yet to develop and become more economically powerful and have emerging middle class are countries like places in Africa, where they obviously don't have much use for fur in most of Africa or South America. They have very warm climates there. So I'm not sure that demand is going to be what changes the fur market in the future. I'm starting to think more and more that supply is more important component of the market than demand. And what affects supply? Well, 80% of the world fur market, as far as I know, it comes from ranch fur. And the wild fur that guys like me produce is about 20% of all the fur consumed in the world. And so we are kind of riding on the backs of ranch fur prices, and relying on ranch production over or underproduction to influence the prices for ranch and wild fur. And so we're seeing right now is because of COVID-19, the production of ranch mink has dropped considerably. Part of it has to do with the culls in the mink ranches, because a lot of mink farms had COVID-19 get in the mink population, in the herds, and they were required to cull animals to prevent the spread of the virus. So that was really a big deal, and there was a lot of culling going on. In other words, those animals were killed and they were not put into production of fur items. And so that supply, that influenced the supply. But I think more than anything, economics have influenced the supply. I'm just going to pull up a quick chart that I have, and I'm sorry I can't share this with you, but this shows the production of mink pelts annually from 2010 to 2019, and it shows that Denmark was producing about 13 or so million mink pelts in 2010. That rose up during the high prices to 18 to 19 million, and then it dropped back down to about where it started right now. A year ago, 2019, it was back down to around 12 million or so, and I'm sure that has dropped considerably since then over the last year and a half or so. However, the big story is in China. China began developing infrastructure for raising ranch mink of their own. And from 2010 to 2014, China's ranch mink production went from estimated around 20 million pelts to around 60 million. So they tripled their production. And then from 2014, when the prices crashed, all the way down till today, they went from 60 million down to a little over 10 million. And so if that's an indicator, which I believe it is, of the overall production worldwide of mink pelts, and for that matter, other ranch fur pelts, we're in a place today where the supply is much, much, much lower. And even though demand is a lot lower, I think supply has gone down so much that we're finally, as the little bit of demand is picking up, as the economies are starting to recover and come out of lockdown, the demand is there and the supply isn't. And so we've seen a couple of recent auction results from one was Russian sable, which are similar to like United States and Canada marten. Those prices were considerably better than they have been recently. So the Russian sable auction, there were 2 auctions in February, and those the average price increased by about 25% from December. So that was a very important increase. And then Saga Furs in Denmark, which sells most of the ranch mink worldwide, they just this past weekend had a big auction, and they sold a lot of fur. Fur Harvesters auction, which is our North American wild fur auction house, has not had a sale recently, and they are planning on having one next month in April. Depending on whether the country is in lockdown still and not allowing travel from outside, that's likely to be another online auction with no in-person participation from other countries. So we won't get a real good handle on what's going on until they can actually have an in-person auction where people from all over the world, fur buyers, can come in and actually see the fur that they're going to bid on, and they will come with a lot of orders and demand from furriers that have been selling products as the economy recovers and need to replace inventory. So that's what's going on a large scale. Now, meanwhile, in the U.S., let's talk about more detailed results of fur auctions that actually influence what you might be doing if you're a trapper out there and you're selling some fur. So I put together the results from several auctions over throughout, all the way from eastern United States, New York and Pennsylvania, a little bit in Missouri, and then Idaho and Montana. So these were state auctions. A large percentage of state Trapper Association auctions have been canceled this year due to COVID, but these were auctions that were held. I've got results from 10 or 11 of them here, and there were a couple more that were held this weekend that I haven't gotten results from yet, but they are very similar. And what we're seeing overall is an increase in prices of fur from the huge drop in the really, really poor, terrible prices we'd seen before. Now, it's not a huge increase, and there's some items that we're not going to see the prices we saw 3-4 years ago. But it's improvement. And like I said in the podcast episode, it's a bit of a bounce. I called this bottom, I thought was going to take place in 2020, and we were going to start to see a slow recovery. And that was prior to COVID. And when that occurred, it basically just delayed everything by a year. But the supply-demand factors that have always been at play over the past several years are coming around and finally causing these prices to come back up. So I think we're going to see some improvement, and we already are seeing improvement. Let's start with beaver prices. So beaver varied substantially. There were some early auctions in the east where, and even into February, where there wasn't a lot of demand for beaver pelts, and places where the pelt quality was a little lower. We were looking at sometimes as low as $3 to $5 for a beaver pelt, but most of them were $8 to $10. So 8 to 10 is very low. It's terrible, really, for beaver. However, and some of them, New York hit 12 on one of the auctions, but that is still, a few months ago you couldn't sell for any price. And so the beaver pelts are starting to move a little more. Now, the encouraging thing was a couple of the western sales, Idaho and Montana, had beaver averages of $18 to $22 a pelt. So those were probably some smaller buyers that were looking for beaver pelts for specific projects. People making mitts or hats or other things that they're going to sell locally, because they're relatively small quantities, but that was encouraging. And I've sold beaver pelts from northern Maine, which is probably some of the best beaver pelts that are out there, comparable to Alaska and Canada. They're very dark and very thick, full, long hair, just a really high quality pelt, and getting about $25 average. And that's to local small markets, people that are making items from the fur. There is not an international market for beaver pelts other than the Hatter market, which is a felt product, and they're basically looking for quantity, not quality, and they're paying by the pound. They're grinding up those pelts and making Stetson cowboy hats with them and similar items. But the craft market is allowing for some of those higher end beaver to sell, and they're moving pretty decent. Don't want to say great, but pretty decent. Bobcat. Now, we know Bobcat, there's a big difference between western cats and eastern cats. The western spotted cats, the clear white bellies with dark spots and really large areas of white belly and dark spots, those are the bobcats that have been in demand for a long time, and they continue to be in demand. But the good old days of $500 to $700 averages on those cats is over. That is a very high-end market. It's very popular in Russia for high-end coats, and there is a small percentage of the population that can afford that, but they're not very abundant, and they are shrinking recently. So that's kind of gone away. Montana had some of the better cats in their sale, and they averaged $217. Idaho had a couple of auctions that averaged $139 and $170, and so in those there were a few lower quality cats mixed in with, in particularly I think in the Idaho auction, one of them. But still, you're talking the good western cats. It's about what you're going to expect is probably around $150 to $200 on average. As you get into the eastern bobcats, I think I talked about this in the live stream I did recently. I think I'd said around $30, and it looks like those averages right across the board are all around $30. Some of them a little lower, and some of them creeping up to $42, $44 in some cases. But yeah, for the most part, $30 to $40 for eastern bobcats and southern bobcats. Coyotes, this has been the hot market the last couple of years. The western coyotes, the pale coyotes with really high quality silky fur, have been used as parka trim for Canada Goose expedition parkas and other similar Canada Goose imitators. That market is starting to fade, but it's still there, and there is still demand for those better quality coyotes, and they're selling for about $50 or $60. So they're not the $70 to $100 that we saw 2 years ago. We had the big drop, and then you couldn't sell them at all for a while, but now we're starting to see that demand kind of stabilize around $50 to $60 averages. Some guys are getting a little over 60 for their better collections, and the eastern coyotes are somewhere around 20 on average. I mean, I'll rattle off New York 20 and 23, Missouri 21, Pennsylvania around 15. Raccoon was an item that you could not sell earlier in the season at all for any price, and still smaller coons you can't really sell. They're very difficult to sell. You won't get much for them at all, if anything. But Grunwald Fur and Wool got ahead of the trend. I think they knew what was going on, and they anticipated a recovery, and they were paying low prices, but they were steadily buying raccoons the last couple of months. And as far as I can tell, they're mostly paying $5 or $6 for good quality coons. And when you look at the auction results, that's pretty similar. I mean, the Montana auction got $10 for coons, but that was kind of an outlier. One of the Idaho auctions got between $8 and $9. The rest of them were between $3 and $6. A lot of $4 to $5 averages on raccoons. So again, it's nothing spectacular, but they're moving. That's the encouraging part, is the fur is actually moving. And I have a pretty strong feeling that as things come online here and we start seeing auctions, we're going to see some major advances in the coon prices, and for that matter, probably most of these prices across the board. Muskrat has held up pretty decent for, the average the last couple of years has been about what it is now. Really, I mean, you've had a few periods where rats did pretty well, but for the most part, rats are averaging between $3 and $4 a pelt. Your better quality rats, you might get over $4. The lower quality, you might get $2.50 to $3, but pretty much $3 to $4. They've been hovering around that, and they've been selling that way all season long. When other than maybe a few short interruptions. Red fox continues to be disappointing, $10 to $15 for the most part, and in a few cases there have been averages just over 15, but 10 to 15 is pretty much where red fox are at. And even the eastern fox, some of them are even a little bit less than that. So there's just not much demand for red fox right now. Wild mink, there's not much demand as well, but surprisingly they are moving. Wild mink are often a substitute for ranch mink, and with ranch mink prices being so low, there hasn't really been much reason for someone to try to buy large collections of wild mink. However, I think that will potentially change, and maybe some of these mink have been purchased on speculation, with some of the buyers thinking that they're going to be able to move them a little better. But for the most part, wild mink are selling for somewhere around $5 or $6 average. Otter has been seeing a very wide variation in prices depending on where you're at. For the most part, the otter averages for the commercial market have been between $15 and $30. Now this is a long ways off from when we saw otter prices upwards of $100, whatever it was, eight years ago or something like that. We're not going to get back there, I don't think, for a very long time. But we did see a couple of highlights where in Idaho and Montana, otters sold for $50 to $60. There were limited collections there. There are limited quantities of otter trapped in those areas anyway. And apparently there were some buyers that were really looking for otter, and there was a little bit of bidding competition. And so those commanded a little better price. A lot of times the small craft markets can command a better price than the overall, the big commodity market for pelts like that. So there's a wide variation. You could do well with otter, or you could just sell them on the market for what you can get. Martin are seeing a little bit of improvement, around $25, which is good because I sold mine last year for less than $7 or less than $8, which was pathetic. Fisher, there aren't a lot of Fisher selling, and those all the Martin results are from eastern and the western mountains, Rocky Mountains. Those are usually your lower quality Martin anyway. Once we start seeing Alaska and Canada results, I think we're going to see that those are probably going to, if things look like they're looking, $50, $60, maybe even $70. I think that's a definite possibility. So that would be encouraging. Fisher, $20 to $40. Skunk, between $5 and $8. And not many weasels have sold. Badgers have varied a lot, between $15 and $45. Not a lot of badgers sold either. Gray fox, $10 to $15. Most of the gray fox sold around $12. And for the other big bright spot, of course, is the beaver castor market. And dried castor was selling for, we had one low in one of the auctions at $45, but most of the castor is selling for between $75 and $85 a pound, with a little, one auction got $110. But around $80 a pound for castor, that's pretty awesome. I mean, that really increases the value of a beaver that you catch. So it's a good little bright spot there, and a direct result of the low beaver harvest. There's not a lot of castor being available for sale. So with that, guys, I think that's as far as we'll go. Check out the Trapping Today podcast for more information if you would like to get more like really detailed fur price information, I'll probably do something else here in the future as well to give you a little more of an update on as things change, as we have more results. A couple of quick plugs. I get a new book out, A Fall Fur Hunt in Maine. It is a 110-page book about an 1859 pre-Civil War trapping adventure in northern Maine by Manly Hardy. He wrote the story in 1910. He was in his late 20s, and he went out in the woods with another guy, and they built a cabin. They trapped marten and fisher with deadfall traps that they built themselves. It's just an incredible story about how people survived out in the woods way back then. $10 on Amazon, can't beat it. And then Walter Arnold, Maine Trapper, Stories from One of the Last Mountain Men. Really been a popular book, sold hundreds of copies of this so far, and you can find that on Amazon as well, or on trappingtodaystore.com. All right, guys, thanks. Take care. We'll catch you in the next one.